The Victorian Albert Museum has a very large and important collection of Nazarite plasterwork. This plasterwork dates from mainly the 14th and 15th century, when the Alhambra Palace in Granada, Spain was under the rule of the Nazarite dynasty. Back in 2004, when we were working towards the new architecture galleries in the museum, I came across two panels of Nazarite plasterwork. That was the first time that I came close to this collection. I realized when I started making observations under the microscope that there was a lot to be learned from these objects. In the collection we had a huge variety of motifs, sizes and materials. I realized that we have different types of mortars, different finishes on the surface. During the study of these objects we realized that some of the panels were showing different types of plaster, gypsum plaster. Some were made out of plaster of Paris, which is a most modern type of gypsum plaster, and some were showing a more traditional handmade gypsum plaster. This led us to think that we had differences within the collection. That's why we wanted to get deeper into the study of these mortars and the surfaces in order to be able to distinguish which objects were original from the Nazarite period and which ones were probably from the 19th century reproductions. To find out the original location of these panels was very important in order to understand these objects in their context. These objects were removed from the building at a certain time, and we want to understand why they were removed and how that relates to the history of the Alhambra. In some parts of the building, I'm talking about the Alhambra Palace, the chronology of the different construction phases is a bit confusing. In order to understand that, and understanding as well which sultan or king organized some of these refurbishments within the building, it's important to understand well the plasterwork interiors. So the V&I collection plays a very important part on that. And another very interesting aspect, it relates slightly to this design fashion about Islamic art that was so in vogue in Victorian times. Islamic fashion was everywhere in Britain at the time, and travelers that went to Spain and mainly to Granada, they wanted to bring back a piece of the Alhambra with themselves. And that's one of the origins as well of our collection. Most of these fragments came from private collections where they originally were bought or brought from the Alhambra as a souvenir. So mainly in the 19th century we find that there is a real market in Granada for plasterwork. So there are many different workshops appearing in Granada where they are producing plasterwork in the Islamic style, or even just copies of the plasterwork from the Alhambra Palace. In some cases, they even can produce a certain patina to the objects to make them look original. So that's the confusing part of this collection, that some objects probably date from the 19th century. But the characteristics of the materials will differ from those in the Nazarite periods. The plasters produced in the 19th century are technically different to those produced in the Nazarite period. We find that the plaster is much finer and white. It's mainly plaster of Paris, which is completely different to the one used by the Nazarites, which was produced manually, had lots of impurities. In the surface there are a white primary layer, which doesn't appear in most of the 19th century examples. The pigments used during the Nazarite period are mainly traditional pigments as vermilion, lapis lazuli, when in panels that date from the 19th century we find, for example, Prussian blue, which is obviously a modern pigment. That's another aspect of the material and technique that help us to date an object. The Islamic plasterwork technique traveled from the Middle East through North Africa into South Spain. So we want to reflect what are the relations with plasterwork that we find in North Africa and the Middle East in terms of technique and materials. Within the REMAI project, we took samples of all the different objects that were selected in the different institutions, and they were sent to one single center in Spain, in the University of Jaén. We thought it was interesting that all the samples of plaster would be analyzed in one single center by one single team. That proved very rewarding. This team, they have a long experience of working with plaster and working with plaster from the Alhambra. We took samples from the mortars, from the primary layers and from the pigmentation that we found in the surface. As a result of this project, we understood much better the collection we have in the V&A, particularly these 5 fragments that we've studied. Now we know exactly where they come from in the building. We know the kind of plaster they used at the time. We understand better the decorative scheme we found in the surface. This is an example of a Nazarite plasterwork. We find that these panels were cast with molds probably made out of clay. We can see the white plasterwork. They used to use a very white, refined plaster, but still we can see under the microscope impurities of clay and quartz in the mixture, which makes a difference from the 19th century plaster of Paris. We can see at the back as well examples of the black gypsum. This is a different type of gypsum than the Nazarite used in order to attach the panels to the wall, which is a much coarser and has a higher quantity of impurities. We found that this panel comes from the royal baths in the Comares Palace, particularly in a certain room called La Sala de las Camas, a room where people would undress before getting into the steaming rooms. To identify this object from that area, it's very interesting because the Sala de las Camas was completely conserved by Contreras at the end of the 19th century, following the examples of Owen Jones plates from his Grammar of Ornament. The panels that we found in that room nowadays are exactly the same, but the design is slightly bigger. So we think that these panels were probably the originals, and they used them as a pattern to create new ones. So we are looking at one of the remaining plasterwork panels from that area of the Alhambra. We could understand better as well the decoration we find in the surface. As you can see, we find the background of palm leaves, or this sort of vegetal decoration is called ataurique. And we find as well different Kufic inscriptions. We find here this area, which means baraka, which is basically a blessing. And then we have another inscription, mixture of Kufic and cursive in here. Here we find the words of Allah, and means the sovereignty belongs to Allah. We find again this vegetal decoration of palm leaves in the background, the ataurique. We find as well this strap work framing the frieze, which is just basically lines that interlock each other, forming these knots. And then we can see again cursive inscriptions that in this case is part of the Nazarite motto that meant Allah is the only conqueror. And it's quite interesting because this motto was first used around this period. We found traces of polychromy. We can see vermilion in the background, these red remains of pigment. We have remains of blue in the leaves, and we have as well these black little dots on description. These black traces are actually remains of very corroded tin leaf. This adds a very interesting aspect to this polychromy because tin leaf would have been used either to imitate gold. Tin would have had a very silvery shine, but with a certain varnish on top, you could imitate gold. So it would have been a very cheap way of reproducing gold without actually going to that expense. The back of the panel is giving us information about the construction technique of these panels in the wall during the Nazarite period. They would have applied some blobs of clay in the back of the panel in order to level the panel against the wall, and then from the top they would pour liquid plaster in order to attach completely the panel to the wall. So these holes we find here are just the remaining traces of this clay fixing method they would use right at the beginning of the construction. This is another original fragment of plasterwork from the Alhambra. It comes from the Hall of Comares, and it's made of a very fine white gypsum, which is quite interesting that at this early stage they managed to sieve the gypsum to such a way to produce a very pure mixture, although still under the microscope we can still see impurities within. You can see that the back was scarred originally in order to be able to fix it to the wall with a much coarser mixture of black gypsum. And in the surface we find again the same decoration of ataurique, all these leaves, and then quite an interesting cursive inscription. Thanks to this inscription we managed to identify this panel as from the period of Yusuf I. This cursive inscription means is telling us about the honorific title of Yusuf I, and we can still see traces of the vermilion red paint on top of the characters. The background has a very pure layer of lapis lazuli, which would have been the original pigment used. We found as well traces of a later overpaint of azurite that this overpaint could have been applied in Christian times. This fragment of plaster is quite interesting because it's the only example of black gypsum that we have in the collection. Black gypsum, as I said earlier, was used to fix cast panels to the wall, but at the same time black gypsum could have been used just to be carved directly on the wall in order to produce some geometrical designs, as is this case of this eight-pointed star. We can still see traces of the preparatory drawings, these geometrical shapes that they probably traced on the fresh plaster in the wall, and they would have followed these lines in order to carve the fresh black gypsum in order to create this magnificent star. Once the carving was complete, usually the whole area would have been covered with a white priming layer of a mixture of probably egg white and fine gypsum. And this is the remains that we find in the panel of that original priming layer that would have given a very white finish to the whole of the wall. We can see here the black gypsum. We can see the black gypsum in more detail, how it differs from the most white and pure white gypsum from the cast panels. This gypsum is much coarser, its porosity is more heterogeneous and much bigger, and we find bigger impurities in its mixture. This panel probably didn't come from the Alhambra Palace itself, but rather probably came from an arch in one of the typical Nazarite patios in a Nazarite palace. This star would have been the centerpiece of one of the spandrels of these arches. This is another panel that benefited from the conservation treatment, as we could, after the cleaning treatment, we could observe the surface much more clearly. These traces of orange clay relate to the releasing agent that the Nazarite alarifes or masons, they would have applied to the molds in order to release the later cast in a much easier way. We found several barakas or blessings. We see one here, and we see them here. and here again. Then we have in this cartouche in the middle the NAZARÍ motto, that means just Allah is the only conqueror. And then we find in these little cartouche here at the top, perpetual health. We have two identical panels in the collection, and we now know that they come from the lower floor of the Tower of the Peinador.